You know them when you see them. Big, bold, hulking buildings made mostly of concrete. They're raw and dominating. Some might even call them brutal. This style of architecture is found all over the world, in government buildings, housing complexes, and on school campuses. It's a style that over the past 60 years has been both vilified and beloved. There have been equal calls to rid our cities of them as there are to preserve them. I'm talking about brutalist architecture, a style that emerged in Europe following World War II, reaching its height of popularity in the 1960s and 70s before being largely neglected in the subsequent decades. But what is it about brutalism that causes such intense reactions? Does it deserve all the hate it gets? And where does the term brutalism even come from? Hey everyone, my name's Steve. I'm an architecture writer, and join me as we take a deep dive into brutalist architecture here on Architecture 101. But before we get started, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss out on all things architecture. If you've ever looked up the history of brutalism, you'll find many sources saying that the name brutalism was a rough translation from the Le Corbusier concept beton brut, which is French for raw concrete. The story goes that Corbusier was tasked with designing the Unité de Habitation in France, or the Madhouse, as the locals called it, which was a massive housing block that would feature space for 1,600 residents and offer amenities like a grocery store and a rooftop garden. Originally, the tower was supposed to be designed with a smooth concrete exterior, a thing that Corbusier had experimented with in the past. However, there was a misunderstanding among the 80 contractors working on site, and the building's concrete was anything but smooth. There were marks left on the concrete from the wooden formwork. Supposedly, Corbusier, in his frustration, called it a massacre of concrete and declared, quote, "Leave it brut." The building opened in 1952 and revolutionized residential architecture both in design and in materials. And he even began to embrace the rough concrete look in his subsequent buildings all over the world. He loved the honesty and the functionality of raw concrete, and he eventually coined the term beton brut. And there you go. Brutalism is born, right? Not exactly. It's a great story, and while Corbusier's beton brut did influence later brutalism, it's not a translation of the French phrase. For that, we've got to travel to 1940s Stockholm, Sweden. The architect Hans Asplund was the first to coin the term neo-brutalism. In 1949, the term was coined to distinguish Swedish modernism from the larger modernist movements elsewhere in the world. It soon became a term spoken in Stockholm's architecture circles, and according to historian Anthony Vidler, the term caught the attention of visiting British architects. They took the phrase back with them to England, where it was applied by avant-garde architects looking to use architecture as a vehicle for creating a socialist utopia. For Britain, they were still trying to pick up the pieces from years of devastating war. Entire cities needed rebuilding, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. To combat this, Britain expanded their social housing program, offering commissions to large numbers of ambitious, politically minded architects who were ready to take their academic ideas and apply them in the real world. The most prominent new voices were Alison and Peter Smithson. Their designs for the unbuilt Golden Lane estate and the Hunstanton School in 1952 cemented themselves as the leaders of Britain's new brutalist movement. If you look at the Hunstanton School today, it might not look brutalist. In fact, it might look more like the works of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. But if we look closer, we can see what makes it brutalist. Remember that the prevailing modernist thought at the time was that architecture should embody the perfection and precision of the machine age. Materials were to be refined and pure. Everything needed to be perfect. The Hunstanton School does not adhere to this thinking. Instead, rough, raw materials were the better choice because they were honest. Both modernists and brutalists saw ornamentation as a crime. And for brutalists, refined materials were no different than traditional ornamentation. So the school features raw brick, exposed steel beams, concrete floors, and the building's utilities on full display. The Smithsons and other brutalists thought that this embrace of raw materials would lead to a better society, one that was for transparency and truth. While many of Smithson's buildings were built of brick and steel, much of the early brutalists saw concrete as the best material to express honesty. Concrete was chosen not only because it offered architects the ability to create interesting forms and give that raw appearance, it was also incredibly cheaper than traditional materials. Soon, concrete would serve as the go-to material for brutalist architects intent on redefining architecture. A lofty goal for a style, but such ambition soon captured the attention of the architecture critic Rainer Banham. In 1955, Banham wrote his seminal article, The New Brutalism. In it, he aimed to define just what brutalism was. He concluded that, quote, New Brutalism eludes precise description, while remaining a living force in contemporary British architecture, essentially saying that there was no set definition, but rather a dedication to creating a utopia with raw materials. This was partly the reason that Banham makes the link between British brutalists and Corbusier's beton brut. He saw the similarities between British architects and Corbusier and tried to bring the two independent styles together, though Corbusier would reject the label that his buildings were brutalist. Nevertheless, Banham saw that by linking Corbusier's ideas with the British movement, brutalism gained greater legitimacy. It also helped that brut sounded a lot like brutal. Anyway, Banham was also obsessed with buildings as objects or images. This meant that it was okay, if not preferable, for a building to not even look like a building, that they were independent from their surroundings, an idea that would be played with as the style matured. Beyond aesthetics, Banham stressed that it could not simply be an aesthetic movement, but a social one as well. Brutalist architecture needed to enact social change. The way people lived within buildings and moved through them should demonstrate what a true socialist utopia looks like. Everyone would be equal and have access to the same amenities. Within a brutalist building, everything was perfect. It's important to note that in the early years of brutalism in Britain, the style was liked by residents because of its newness. People clamored to live in these new brutalist buildings. Among these popular buildings were those designed by the architect Erno Goldfinger. His Balfron and Trellick towers were landmarks of the movement, as they embodied the socialist ideals that the Smithsons and Banham advocated for. But not everyone was a fan, though. The writer of the James Bond series famously detested the works of Goldfinger, ultimately naming Bond's arch-nemesis after the architect. By the end of the 1950s, brutalism expanded beyond Britain and elsewhere in Europe, mainly to Eastern Europe, where Soviet-controlled countries used the ideas of brutalism as a format for their social housing. However, unlike the British housing projects, these did not attract the same positivity from its residents. When brutalism made it to America, it also found its way into affordable housing, mainly for economic reasons. These projects were different from the Smithsons and were based on Corbusier's radiant city concept. They were often tall, identical, cruciform towers that were spaced apart with large lawns and parks between. They were disconnected from the rest of the city and were often placed on the site of historically poor, yet vibrant communities. As with the British social housing, these were originally met with praise, but as we'll discuss later, that praise was short-lived. Beyond social housing, brutalism made its way onto college campuses in the wake of the college building boom of the 1950s and 60s. Among the most notable is here at Yale, the Art and Architecture building designed by Paul Rudolph from 1963. Given the building's small site, Rudolph accentuates the verticality of the building with these strong towers, between which were windows. Inside, 30 different levels were incorporated across the 7-story building. While it was heralded for its unique use of space, it was later criticized for its sometimes cramped interior and was eventually expanded in the 2000s. Nevertheless, it brought a sense of drama and presence and helped college campuses embrace new architecture styles. Another important work of brutalism on a college campus is the Geisel Library a decade later by William Pereira at UC San Diego. This building perfectly captures what Banham was saying when he talked about architecture as an image. This gravity-defying building with its concrete fingers gently holding up the library was placed on a large plaza that allowed the building to stand triumphantly, while the entrance was kept hidden underneath the plaza. Nearby, on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in La Jolla, California, stands the Salk Institute. For many, it is one of the most beautiful brutalist buildings. Designed by Louis Kahn in 1965, it broke away from early brutalists by incorporating the building's context within the design. Kahn was no stranger to brutalism. He had designed several important brutalist buildings, including the Kimball Art Museum and the National Parliament Building in Bangladesh. The Salk Institute's two identical buildings flanked each other on either side of a large plaza. The building's windows are angled towards the ocean in the distance. All the laboratories and offices were open to the outside, linked by a network of exterior walkways and stairs. The rough concrete was contrasted by the weathered wood that framed the windows. It was a place that felt grand and still intimate. Crossing the country, we see another figure of American brutalism, Marcel Breuer. He designed the original Whitney Museum in 1966. The building resembles an inverted ziggurat-like structure, with floors cantilevering out to maximize the building's small site. The building also has only a few windows, which fails to give the building a sense of scale and makes it feel ominous in the rather quiet neighborhood it resides in. It was no wonder that the building was controversial. The famed architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable famously wrote that it was, quote, the most disliked building in New York, but also argued that it was, quote, harsh and handsome. Brutalism also found a home in South America. Lina Bobardi brought her own flair to the style with her Museum of Art in São Paulo, which was completed in 1968. It was one of the first buildings in Brazil built of reinforced concrete, and appears to defy gravity as its large gallery space looms above the ground, resting effortlessly on 4 concrete columns. Of course, a conversation of brutalism is not complete without discussing this place, the Boston City Hall. Designed by Kallman, McKinnell, and Knowles, it was the winning submission out of 256 different schemes. It was chosen because it was the only design in the competition that featured the monumentality that the jury wanted. They wanted a building that would appear to stand the test of time, like a modern reinterpretation of past grand architecture. Symbolism was used throughout the building. The columns are seen as abstractions of traditional columns, while the red brick in the plaza and on the bottom floor symbolizes the historical use of brick in the city. The offices of the mayor and council chamber protrude from the inverted ziggurat facade, as though the building was placing government officials on stage. Above are administrative offices, which are shown symbolically with a standard pattern of windows. To add to the symbolism, the architects wanted to create a varying degree of textures within the building. It uses a mixture of cast-in-place, precast concrete, and brick throughout. The cast-in-place concrete was like other brutalist buildings and contrasted nicely from the smoothness of the precast sections. The brick added some much-needed color to the spaces. When it opened, it received mixed reviews. The critics loved it. Ada Louise Huxtable said that the building was a symbol of, quote, excellence. Another critic said that the building, quote, carries an authority that results from the clarity, articulation, and intensity of imagination with which it has been formed. The average person was not so thrilled by it. They saw it as imposing and authoritarian. The average person, understandably, did not get the symbolism. And this is the issue surrounding brutalism. There was a disconnect between the academics who loved it and saw it as a step toward utopia and the public that widely hated it, seeing it as hostile and dystopic. And they often lacked context, so they felt disconnected from the rest of the city. In the case of large housing projects, they lacked a unique identity. They just weren't places where people could feel comfortable. Another issue with brutalism was the cost to maintain it. Concrete deteriorates after a while, and the lack of maintenance with these buildings causes them to look even more hostile to people, like the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., which has suffered from years of neglect as the government tries to determine just what to do with it. All of this was why the popularity of the style began to fade in the late 1970s. During this time, a return to classical ideas on architecture would lead to postmodernism. And yet all these years later, brutalism is seeing a resurgence. There are books, articles, and Instagram pages that are dedicated to highlighting the inventiveness and sculptural nature of the style. Even places like Boston City Hall, once under threat of demolition 20 years ago, has garnered a loyal group of supporters. The buildings designed by Goldfinger have become highly coveted places to live, and many of Corbusier's beton brut buildings have become UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But this love of brutalism is more about the interesting and unique aesthetics of the style rather than its impact on our cities. If we look at brutalism solely on aesthetics, it's amazing that a material like concrete can defy gravity the way that it does in these buildings. However, brutalism was about ethics, too, and in that form it failed. People, for a short time at least, saw brutalism as the architecture of utopia, but rather quickly it failed in its promise. And so brutalism remains in this gray area within the timeline of architecture. For every reason why we don't like it, there seems to be another reason as to why it's great. It could be argued that we might not have the high abstract and sculptural buildings we see today if not for brutalism breaking the mold and allowing architects to think of architecture as more than simply boxes. What can be taken away from brutalism and its history is the knowledge that it's good to have lofty ambitions for our architecture. But the quest for an ideal should not come at the expense of creating a welcoming place for people. Architecture is about giving people a place that enlivens them, not challenges them. That being said, even for people who hate brutalism, it's hard not to be in awe of these places, as they're rare moments when the rest of the world seems to slip away and you're completely enveloped in a true architectural experience. Thank you for watching. What do you think about brutalism? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about brutalist architecture, visit arcbydesign.com. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode of all things architecture. Anyway, thanks again for watching. My name's Steve, and I'll see you next time for another edition of Architecture 101.